So this is a great day for us as we deliver on one of these key mandates. And the last tie-back we had, which was in May, our president, William Ruto, who was then the deputy president, had this to say because OSR was on the agenda. And allow me to quote him, because at that tie-back, he said, OSR is a sleeping giant. And this is time, in the new dispensation, it's time to awaken the sleeping giant. If there's a number we must take away today, it is 216 billion shillings against 31 billion shillings. That says a lot. And imagine, even if we don't really reduce the equitable share that every county gets, if you add 216 billion shillings to the current 370 billion that counties get in form of equitable share, we're talking about in excess of $500 billion shillings for financing devolution. That can have a huge catalytic developmental impact. We have talked a lot about our city counties, our urban counties struggling. And in terms of fiscal responsibility principles, we, and I guess all the PFM institutions, have argued here severally that our counties are not meeting their fiscal responsibility principles. One, they're spending in excess of 35% of their revenue on salaries. Nairobi, for example, spends in excess of 50% of their revenues on wages. If you turn that logic on its head and argue that Nairobi can collect in excess of 50 billion shillings, this would mean that with a stroke of a pen, Nairobi is no longer struggling to adhere to their fiscal responsibility principles. And if you look at a lot of counties that argue that they inherited a lot of municipalities with huge liabilities, these are the same counties that have the potential to generate a lot more revenue. So it is so much easier for them to exceed or meet all the legal requirements or the PFM requirements as articulated in the PFM Act, where they need to spend over 30% of their revenues on development. Nairobi spends about 15%. And I want to say it's not a name and shame report. It is really a report that is really sort of giving you the true north. Where should we aim to go? It's not name and shame. It's really telling you as county governments, where or what can we do? How can we take our country forward? So Nairobi currently spends only 15% of their revenues on development. But you can imagine if they now get into best practice, what that would mean in terms of the development and the development that it can unlock in our cities. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me actually say that we are launching this report in the backdrop of a very tight fiscal situation. I think it's all clear to us that it's going to be much, much harder in the medium term to get additional resources to allocate to both levels of government. It is time, in our view, to look within before the economy recovers from the current drought, which is affecting actually the entire Horn, the war in Ukraine, and the lagging effects of COVID-19. So looking within is going to be so important for counties to help you smooth your spending as we readjust our fiscal deficit. But the good news is what we are bringing today in this report, that indeed you can look within and find the resources that will require to run your recurrent spending. This, in my view, is a good news that we are bringing today. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to share some of the perspectives that we have learned in our last 6 years of our 12 duty. And I want to say this is probably the last major report that we will launch before we exit the commission later this year. What have we learned? And this I will give particularly to Governor Balaza, that besides all the things you plan to do automate, put a board. What's going to be most important, and what we have observed, what's going to be important is the tone at the top. What signal is the governor sending? What are you telling your revenue officers? What are you telling your citizens? The tone at the top is going to be most important. This is what we observed over the last 5 years for counties that have been able to improve their own revenues significantly. And allow me to single out Laikipia because I know the governor was very clear in setting up his revenue board, giving them targets. He set the light tone at the top, which saw that county increase their revenue from half of 500 million to close to $1 billion. So what you take away to your governor, if he wants to help you as revenue officers or CCs for finance, is he has to set the right tone at the top. That is the most significant pillar in this journey of enhancing your revenue. The other thing we have learned is that property taxes are important. And like you saw from the presentation, we are only tinkering at the margin in correcting what we could in form of property taxes. But what's going to be important is that your variation rules are updated. We all know, for example, what's happening in Upper Hill. We all pay rates based on the value of those properties in the RAETs. So a property that is worth billions is currently paying rates at the value of maybe about 100 million. So this is important, but it is very difficult. We know that those who have tried are usually taken to court. That if you try today to use the new variation law, probably someone will take you to court. But we learned something interesting from Germany. How can you take a first step towards updating your property rules? And what they did in the city of Berlin is they agreed they would have a revenue neutral property valuation or updating their values, but also taking the citizens along. So maybe a revenue neutral where you argue, I want to know the right value, but you can continue paying rates at the current position. That probably gives you resistance and you're less likely to be taken to court. So updating your variation laws is going to be important. Very difficult politically, but it's going to be another very critical pillar in this journey. The third thing that we learned is that incentives matter. Incentives matter a lot. And in the last two formulas for sharing revenue, or the basis for sharing revenue, we had a small parameter, a competitive parameter that the more a county corrected year on year, the more they got from the equitable share. That was so catalytic. When we had that parameter, governors used to call me at the end of the year and tell me, I think Control of Budget has not reported our revenues correctly. We collected a lot more than that. Governors would call and ask, Chair, I'm number what in terms of revenue effort? Those were regular calls. Sadly, Governor Kingi, we lost that in the last Senate. We lost that incentive parameter. And we can see there was laxity now setting in. It is our prayer and our hope that the fourth Senate, in determining the fourth basis, would bring those incentives to correct revenue back. Just make it competitive, that there is a reward when counties correct more, they can get more. So incentives matter, and we can actually urge you, even at the county level, create incentives either for your revenue boards, if you have them, and if not, you can come up with a mechanism of putting in place the right incentive. The other thing we have learned is that, okay, I know the presenters talked about best practice, but we don't have a one-size-fits-all best practice. We have learned that in some counties, revenue boards will work. In some other counties, a revenue board may be too expensive given the level of taxes they can collect. So in such cases, they may just wish to reform their revenue departments and automate. So it is important maybe working with the PFM institutions that are here, because we have partners to help. We are ready to work with you and sort of show what works given your dispensation, given your level. If your county corrects 200 million, clearly a revenue board will not work. It's going to cost a lot more than 200 million to set up a revenue board. So counties are different, and it is important that you discover what really would work for my country, for my county, that is. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, there's been clamor, I don't know if it's still there. In the last season, there was a clamor to have one integrated revenue management system. We have learned that the first thing a governor does when they come into office is throw out the previous revenue system and put in a new one. And that we have so many types of revenue systems currently working in counties. We have also learned that the level of automation varies. In one county, they will have one system that only collects parking fees, and everything else is not corrected. So this is, the automation space is diverse, it's varied. And perhaps Governor Barasa, as the chair of this important committee at the COG, I think this is an important conversation as we begin in the next season. Should we have one revenue system for all counties? Should we, or maybe even use the Kenya Revenue Authority, which Nairobi County threw out? There's a lot of work that has been done by the CRA, by the COG, and together with all PFM institutions, and we have a recommendation. It is our prayer again, Governor Barasa, that the COG can restart this conversation and really see this is something that we can do that will bring coherence and order in this very complex automation of county governments. Allow me to conclude with a quote from Robert Hart, and I'll quote, that taxation is the price which civilized communities pay for the opportunity to remain civilized. That taxation is the price which civilized communities pay for the opportunity to remain civilized. That you can take away, and you can put that, it will be the price that your counties, your citizens are willing to pay to see development and civilization at the county level. So thank you very much.